I always knew I belonged outside. My mother could never keep me in the house, even if she tried. Even when the weather turned and the wind froze up the day, I still found excuses to stay out. Fresh air, sun on your skin, for me, there's nothing better. When I began my career as a park ranger, I think my family breathed a sigh of relief. They were glad I'd found a job that wasn't going to pry me from the outdoors. When I was assigned the Black Hills National Forest, we were all pretty excited. Having a regular view of Mount Rushmore made me really feel the gravity of my work. I was practically working for the president, right? However, it didn't take long for my responsibilities to become routine. Patrol my section of the park, write a new report. It was rare for something abnormal to happen, like a wildfire or emergency assistance or rescue missions. But when things got abnormal, they got exciting. And those were the stories my parents liked to hear about most. There was a light in their eyes anytime I described tracking down a lost hiker to lead them back to civilization. But then, my stories got a little too weird. One day I was sure I saw something scurry across the face of Abraham Lincoln. I was more than 100 meters out, but the sight was unmistakable. A man, I thought, had rappelled down the face of the 16th president. Whoever it was, I knew at once that they were going to jail. You can't just turn Mount Rushmore into your own personal jungle gym without any repercussions. But first, the Park Service needed to get to them. We needed to make sure they were safe. A drop from the front of Rushmore wasn't going to end well. Once we had them safely on the ground, then we could put them through the ringer. I was the first to the summit. There was no point in waiting for my backup. I was confident they'd arrive in a few minutes, even well before my gear was hooked up. I stabilized my climbing gear and peered over the edge. There weren't any signs of climbers in the area. No ropes, no hooks, no glimpses of a harness or a brace. I remember thinking that they were free climbing Mount Rushmore. I checked my radio before continuing. No one had gotten by security, and then I realized, maybe too late, that my support was coming along slowly because of their own skepticism. They didn't believe that I'd seen a person on the monument. In their defense, it should have been impossible. When I tell this story now, it's always at this point that my mother looks at me with concern in her eyes. Disbelief. I recognize it, even though she doesn't say it. She knows that there was never any news reports about this free climber after all. She would have known if there were. She keeps up on that sort of thing on account of my career. But I was confident in what I'd seen, and that day, I was secure in my own harness, and the rope attached to my truck wasn't going anywhere. So, I dropped over the face of Mount Rushmore on my own. I remember calling out for the other climber. The less I saw of them, the more convinced I was that they'd fallen. And meanwhile, that's what I was trying the most to avoid. When I heard the howl, I slipped. I was secure on my line, like I said. I didn't fall. But my gloves slipped from the rocks, and my feet swayed out from under me. I spun. My shoulder crashed into the rock face. Then, I was back in control. I tried not to think of the other climber. If he got spooked like that, he was done for. But where was he? I wish I could say that I looked for him more quickly after that. I wish I could say I spotted him, snapped him into my harness, and dragged him back to the summit. But he was nowhere to be found. And that howl was still rattling my bones. It sounded like a wolf. That part wasn't surprising. What unsettled me was just how close it had been. It sounded like the animal was on top of me, like I'd wandered into its den and it was warning me away. But I was suspended more than 5,000 feet in the air. There couldn't have been an animal near enough to me for their call to be so loud. I started to climb back up alone. I accepted the fact that I wasn't going to find the other hiker, so I started going back up. On my way up, I saw the cave. Tucked behind Teddy Roosevelt's left eye. I saw what was standing there too, in the mouth of that cave. the man I'd seen climbing across the monument. He filled the 8-foot entrance from top to bottom. His shoulders were wide and his body was covered in fur. He stared at me with an open, heaving mouth. His jaw was like a long snout. His eyes reflected the dim light under Roosevelt's brow. I never climbed faster in my life. When I got to the top, my backup had arrived. They laughed at my story. When we didn't find the body of the climber, they laughed some more. Then my parents laughed too. Then my friends. No one wants to believe me, but I know what I saw. Something is living in the face of Teddy Roosevelt. I saw some other rangers descending the monument a few days later. There wasn't a familiar face among them. They were buffing something from the face of the rocks. Claw marks, I wondered? If they were up there, I overlooked them. The group of rangers did avoid the cave entrance. I know, because I watched them. I wanted to see them pass over the area without batting an eye. But they avoided it. They always do, I realized. And now that I know what I'm looking for, I've seen the thing again. Always from far away, but always still there. The 8-foot man climbing across the faces of our presidents. How long has he been there? How many others have seen them? I can't tell my parents anymore. I can't tell anyone. Except, I guess, for you. I've always had a weird relationship with sleep. If I had any sort of destiny, it was that. As a kid, I suffered from night terrors. I'd wake up sometimes twice a night, screaming like the devil himself had visited me in his dreams. My parents weren't particularly educated when it came to mental or spiritual health either, so whatever was causing my night terrors was ignored. I was told to suck it up, keep the screaming to myself, I guess. That's what I did. Now I have a weird relationship with being awake, too. I imagine that's what's led to my current cycle of self-destructive sleeping habits. I'm not a doctor, though, so who knows? Maybe I'm just lacking a very specific vitamin or nutrient. I think that background is important for the story I'm going to tell you. It's a story that's still happening, I think. It happens once every 10 to 15 months. The history is important because I have a lot of familiarity with dreams. I can tell when I'm sleeping. I can tell when the night terror has begun. I've got a few tests that I can work out in my mind. I ask myself the date. I ask myself how I got to wherever it is I'm standing or sitting. One of the questions always pings, and I know that I'm in a dream. I know that whatever I'm dealing with isn't real. My ability to manage the situation depends on those questions, though. And when it turns out I'm not dreaming, the problems become much harder to solve. The mysteries become harder to answer. One night, 6 years ago now, a man came to me. I don't know this man. I'd never seen him before, and although I've seen him since, I still haven't learned his name. I still haven't learned what he wants. The first time was in the window. I was living in a second-story apartment. The small window above my kitchen sink overlooked the street outside. He was standing under the street lamp one night. Only the wide-brimmed hat stood out from the rest of his black silhouette. He cut quite the frightening posture. I laughed to myself then. Spooky figure standing under a streetlight? We've all seen that movie, haven't we? I only watched him because he didn't move. I watched him because, even though I couldn't see his face, I was sure he was looking back at my window. When I turned away to turn off the sink, he was gone. 12 minutes without budging or flinching, and then all of a sudden, he was a ghost. That disappearance was enough for me to ask the questions. I knew the date, I knew where I was, I knew what I was doing. Wide awake, I decided. Wide awake and witnessing some weird neighbor. That's all. 10 months later, he was standing outside my door. Well, not the door to my apartment. He was standing outside the locked glass doors that lead from my building to the street. Night again, dark, same silhouette as before. He was just as still and just as indecipherable. I saw him from the other end of the lobby. I must have stared a full minute before I blinked. Again, he disappeared. This time I felt cold wash over me. Fight or flight was screaming for me to take to the skies. I asked the questions. I was wide awake, and he was gone, so I continued about my night. 15 months later, he was in my hallway. 12 months after that, he was at my door. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't trying to come in. I heard his weight shift on the opposite side of my door, and when I looked through the peephole, there he was. Black clothes, black hat, a face I couldn't see. I felt like I was choking then, like something was pulling the air straight out of my lungs. I asked the questions. I was wide awake. I was terrified. I've seen him standing in the corner of my living room. I've seen him seated at the opposite end of my dinner table. Each time I see him, he's closer. Each time he's closer, I'm more afraid. I wish that I was dreaming. I thought that maybe I was. Maybe my questions weren't working anymore. Microsleep. I don't fully understand it, but I thought maybe I was slipping into my dreams during the day. I started getting a fuller night's rest. I found a medication that worked for me and kept my head on the pillow for the recommended 8 hours a night. No nightmares either. Then I saw him. I saw him standing at the end of my bed while I was sleeping. The sight alone was enough to keep me from moving or running away. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't ask him any questions, and I didn't beg him for mercy. I simply understood that he had come to take me away. All this time, he'd been creeping closer so that he could pick me up and take me with him. I'm sure it doesn't make any sense to assume the man's motives, but I'm telling you, I knew. That was 8 months ago. My desperation is at an all-time high. Is this an apparition? Is this a nightmare I've misdiagnosed? Is there an expert out there somewhere who can help me? I need to know what my options are. Am I doing something that brings him back? Did I ask for this in some strange and unknowable way? I've got a little bit of time, I'm sure, but I'm also sure the man is coming. The man is coming back. He's coming for me, and the next time he appears, he'll be right on top of me. He'll be right on top of me, and then we'll be vanishing together. This story takes place in the small town of Ripley, Tennessee, in the summer of 1995. Back then, Ripley was home to a little pet store nestled in one of its many strip malls right off the highway. I was 16 years old and just acquired my first ever job there at the shop. I was excited about working there. I'd loved animals my whole life and was especially fond of unique birds like Amazon parrots, cockatoos, Indian ringnets. You know, the talking varieties. Needless to say, on my first day at the store, I was completely enamored when my boss introduced me to a cockatoo named Charlie who presided over the front end of the store. Moluccans are the largest of the cockatoo varieties, and Charlie loved to sit on his perch near the store entrance and welcome people in. All day long, you'd hear him up there squawking happily and saying, "Come on in, friends." I admit, it made for a nice shtick. People would come in just to see Charlie and then wind up shopping around and buying a few things while they were there every time. What people didn't realize, though, was that Charlie was much smarter than just being able to give a friendly hello now and again. He was also a watcher of things inside the store. Cockatoos are intelligent birds. Not only can they learn to speak like people, but they can understand the meanings of words, learn their names, and even carry on short, simple conversations if properly socialized. Charlie was one of those special birds that had developed a knack for conversation. I loved closing up the store in the evenings because it gave me time with Charlie to listen to him gab. He'd often go on about the day. He'd squawk and talk about the customers he had seen. For example, he once saw a little girl in a hat that came in and fed him half of her cookie. That night, hours after seeing her, he was still talking about Hat Kid and the treat. When she came back to the store weeks later with a grandma, even though she wasn't wearing the hat, he recognized her and called out, "Hey, hat girl." It was amazing. On my 3rd month of working at the store, though, something tragic happened. One of my coworkers, Derek, was killed in a head-on collision leaving a party. I won't lie and say Derek and I were close. In fact, Derek was probably my least favorite coworker, simply because I didn't really understand why he, who clearly hated animals, had chosen to work in a pet store. Derek was a troubled guy. He was rough with the animals when he'd kennel them. He was constantly yelling at the animals to shut up, and he could be especially mean to Charlie. When Derek died, the whole store went through the motions of losing one of our own. Of all of us who worked at the shop, though, I was probably the least torn up about it. Don't get me wrong, I felt sad for Derek's life being lost and for his family, but he and I just weren't as close as he was with some of the others. On the day of Derek's funeral, I volunteered to work by myself so the others could have that day off and my boss wouldn't have to close the store. Even though we didn't open the store, someone would have to come in and feed and clean up after the animals, so it seemed like a waste to shut down. Besides, I liked it at the store. I wanted to be there as often as I could. So on that day, I was all alone at the shop, and all through the day, little spooky things kept occurring. Locked doors would open up out of nowhere. The radio, which I usually kept tuned to a local country station, would suddenly switch over to heavy metal. And the animals all seemed to be more restless than usual. We had a couple of Persian kittens in the shop who spent the day huddled in the back of their kennel, hissing towards the front. The Cocker Spaniel puppy, who had been playful and jubilant all the day before, was trembling and wanting to be held. The reptiles were all hiding under their logs and rocks. Even Charlie seemed off. "It's a bad day," he kept saying. I thought maybe they were all just picking up on the energy of the shop. After all, it was a bad day. It was a sad day. Animals are naturally intuitive and empathetic toward people, right? They probably sensed it. That still didn't explain the doors or the radio or the sound of the heavy footsteps across the tile when I knew I was alone. I was glad to see closing hour come. I started putting the animals to bed for the night and cleaning up around the shop early. I wanted to get out of the store and home as soon as possible. As always, I left Charlie out of his cage until last. At 7 o'clock, I locked the front doors and carried the tray of animal food dishes to the back room to wash them. I left Charlie on his perch as I always did, and the radio was playing my country station. As I started to wash, though, the radio turned off. It didn't change stations this time. It just turned off. I was in a hurry to get home, though, so I didn't bother going to check out why. The radio had been acting up all day. I wasn't going to fret over it now. But only a minute later, Charlie started screaming. "No Derek," he yelled. "No Derek, no Derek, no Derek, no Derek," over and over and over, like a broken record. I ran from the back to the front of the store to see what was going on, and the lights were flickering. Charlie was on his perch, flapping his wings in fear, still screaming, "No Derek, no Derek." And that's when I realized his head was turned to the side. His eye was staring directly into the back corner of the store. I followed his gaze. There, standing in the corner by the tanks, stood Derek. Blood pouring from his head, one eye popped out of his skull, and he was see-through. The lights of the aquarium were visible right through his body. I screamed louder than I think I ever have, and then the lights came back on. The country music started playing, and Charlie calmed down. I didn't even finish washing the bowls. I said my goodbyes to Charlie, left a note for my boss, and left, never to return.